as Jeremy said, you do all know me, and most of you will know me as the coordinator of AI4SD, or as Vicky pointed out, also the coordinator of the blood testing network. But I also do various other research projects, and one of my keen interests is ethics, because I think that's really, really important. And yeah, so today I'm talking to you with my ethics working group leader hat on. So let's get started. So firstly, I'd just like to say there are 3 of us talking today, but we are comprised of quite a bigger working group. So all pictures are on the slides of our working group. But as Jeremy said, this is an initiative between the Internet of Food Things Network and AI4SD. So even though they're not on the slide, I'd also like to acknowledge Jeremy as one of our funders, and also Simon Pearson, who heads up the Internet of Food Things Network, and Alexis, who's also helped us with some of our work. I'd also like to say it's really nice to present in person again. I haven't presented to real people in the flesh for 2 years, and it is so nice to actually see your faces rather than just like do it to a screen. So how did this all start? Why am I up here talking to you? Well, the Internet of Food Things Network, they've been doing a lot of looking at technology and data and the challenges of sharing data across the really wide, big food supply chain. And they actually published a report, nicely depicted on this slide, in September 2019, looking at some of the ways that we can explore the digitization of the food production chain, which then led to this lovely workshop in Brockenhurst. So there was me, back in February 2020, blissfully unaware of what was about to happen, and mostly just really excited that I booked a holiday to Disneyland. And then I get a call from Steve, Sammy, I need you. Can you come and run an ethics group for me at this workshop? I'm like, yeah, I can probably manage that the day before, it's fine. So dragged poor Sam along, who should have been on this talk sadly, but he got dragged back to the University of Southampton to do a different piece of work. But yes, I dragged Sam along. We drafted some random questions, and I went into this group and met the lovely group of people depicted on the previous slide, who I had no idea that we would all end up such close friends, and that 2 years later, we'd then be doing this again to actually present as a group. But this was a 2-day workshop in the New Forest, and we had a number of different groups, a number of different topics. I was put on the ethics group, and Steve basically wanted us to see what sort of working groups and initiatives we could set up. So the reason he wanted us to talk about ethics is because there is so much data associated with each different point of the food industry. But this data isn't well shared. There's obviously all the standard issues about quality and curation and stuff, but also people don't want to share it with each other. People don't trust each other. And I don't know how much you guys know about Steve's background, but he's done a lot of work on data trusts. And we've been looking at, we need this concept of a shared, trusted mechanism so that people can actually share the data at all different parts of the supply chain, but in a way that they can actually trust the data they're seeing, trust in the people that they're working with. And we think that actually, in order to make that work, we obviously need the people, the data, but we also need cutting-edge technologies, and we need to do something smart with this. But as with most technology, this comes with a wealth of ethical issues, especially when you're sharing sensitive data. So one of the things, we're looking at food as a whole, but we've really concentrated on allergens. And again, like allergen data is actually really personal data, and there are lots and lots of ethical issues to do with that. So we kind of jumped into this with our big question to consider the ethical dimensions of digital collaboration in the food sector, such as the unintended consequences of AI, which is kind of also where we came in from the technology side of things. And yes, Peter, there is a cat. So as promised, there's always a cat in my presentation, and Matthew has promised me a cat in my cartoon. So we sat in a room, we brainstormed, we came up with some very ambitious aims. We were going to explore and support ethical challenges in developing food data trusts, particularly if they incorporate the use of AI and related technologies. We're going to use speculative methods to develop a framework of ethical evaluation, which Naomi is going to tell you about. We want to support ethical practice for data sharing in the food industry. So how are we going to do that? We came up with 3 key strands of our methodology. So our glossary work, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, the use of design fiction, which Naomi is going to talk to you about, and using the moral IT cards, which Peter is going to talk to you about. Now, you might be thinking, I'm in the physical sciences, I do like food, I eat it, I drink drinks, but why are you talking to me about this? But whilst we did look at this in the context of food, we actually think that all the 3 methods that we've used are really, really applicable to ethics and AI in general. And as discussed here today, ethics in data, ethics in scientific discovery, ethics in drug discovery, all the different areas you potentially work in, ethics in materials, those things are also really important as well. So we want to share with you our methodologies so that these could also be used in different scientific domains. So from the glossary side of things, we're all catapulted into this room, all of us from different domains. We represented computer science, agriculture, food, ethics, lots and lots of different people. And we started throwing around, the standard terms you might expect when you talk about AI for ethics. And we quickly realized that actually, even though a bunch of us were saying the same words, we meant completely different things, which can also be a problem cross-domain. And we were like, well, actually, if even we who've come together and we're talking about AI and we're talking about ethics and we're using these words and we still all mean different things, this is definitely going to be a general problem. So, example on my slide, transparency can mean a really different thing depending on what domain you're in. And if you're looking at food, you could be thinking about getting access across your supply chain. Whereas when I think about transparency, I think about the transparency of our AI algorithms or our systems. So again, we're all talking about quite different things. So one of the first pieces of work we did, which we'll talk about slightly at the end because it's one of the papers we've submitted, was to actually sit down and go through and identify all of our key terms and then sit and write down what we all meant by them so we could at least establish a common vocabulary. And I think that's a really important point to do whatever project you're working on. The next step was to do our design fiction work. So I'm going to hand over to Naomi to talk to you about that.
Okay, so hi everyone. I hope you can all see and hear me. Get a thumbs up or not? Yeah, great. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person. I would love to be there in the room with you. I couldn't make it this time, but hopefully in future. So design fiction, speculative design, terms kind of being flung around, and this was something that it's methods that I use a lot. I am working in Imagination Lancaster, which is a design research group, and I use a lot of design methods, including speculative design and design fiction. So when I came to the Brockenhurst event, and people were talking about, what might the ethical questions be in the future, and it was all quite generic and vague and difficult to pin down. So I said, well, have you thought about using these kind of speculative methods? And speculative design really starts to think about making more concrete potential things that might be coming in the future or in possible different futures. And speculative design covers a whole range of different things. We have critical design as well, which is kind of taking a critical lens. And this book by Dunn and Radby, a great introduction. But specifically, what I was interested in perhaps using is a method called design fiction. This is coined by Bruce Sterling, and there's an essay about it by Julian Bleecker, which kind of gives the concept, which is basically that you take this speculation, you think about possible futures or alternate presents, make up this kind of world and scenario, and then you actually design and create objects from that fictional world to then kind of interrogate and ask. So by doing that, you can actually not just say, well, what are the potential ethical questions, but what ethical questions are raised by this object which represents this possibility. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the futures cone, which is very kind of closely tied to speculation, this idea of looking at futures. And I've put this on to give you an idea of why it's a useful approach to these things. And what this basically shows is someone kind of looking into the future, and we have all the different types of futures that we might get to. So in the middle, you have the probable futures, where we think we're probably going to be if nothing much changes, if everything proceeds as we think is most likely. And around that, we have plausible futures, things that might potentially happen that we can see a path to getting to. Perhaps we might want to make an intervention to move it more over to that side. We also have possible futures, a bit more out there, things that perhaps are on the edge of possibility but might need a much larger shift. And what we need to think about as we move from the present into the future is what is the bit that we think is preferable? Where are the futures that we want to be including? So which are the ones that have the not only the best use of, for example, AI technologies, but those that are most ethical, perhaps sustainable, thinking about all these other issues that we might want to consider. So by looking at these potential and plausible and possible futures, we can then decide which we think are the most preferable and think about how to get there. Next slide, please. So the idea of creating these design fictions, and I will say that they are designed, and I'll show you some of the process of that in a minute, is that we're not showing, saying this is definitely what the future is going to look like, but we're opening it up and saying, well, if the future did happen to look like this, what would be some of the things we'd want to think about? Is this a good future or not? So we use these design fictions as props in this speculation, and they help with this imagining and help us think about alternative possibilities. So we're challenging the ideals, values, and beliefs of our society by using this material culture, by these designed objects. Next slide, please. One other thing I just wanted to mention when we're talking about these fictions is sometimes people ask about, especially when they're being used in a perhaps with public or with other people who aren't familiar with it, is are they kind of trying to trick people? Are they deceptive? And how plausible are they? So we need to think about, it does need to be plausible because you are looking at all the different aspects of this. So the closer you can make them to something realistic and reality, the better. But you don't want to be usually deceiving people, and that can be quite a fine line to walk. And there's different versions of this. So some things, are obviously fictional, that you very can clearly see that this is not something which really exists. Some things, it may not be as obvious as that, but you actually clearly identify and say up front, this is a design fiction. This is designed to help us speculate and think about these questions. And there are sometimes that are ambiguous or more concealed, and the idea of those may be to provoke people into having these discussions. But in our project, thinking about the questions of ethics in AI and food systems, we were going for this second one. So we wanted to make things that were definitely identified as being design fiction to help us answer some of these questions. I just put this picture up just to mention that sometimes these boundaries can be a little bit blurred. Some colleagues of mine wrote a paper which was itself a piece of design fiction for the most part, because it was, and this is a good example of the fact that these fictions do not have to be physical objects. It was a paper about legislation around drones and the use of drones for different things and the ethical questions, but it was written as if this was real legislation, and then at the end it said, actually, this is not something which currently exists, it's something proposed for the future, and we're investigating it through this design fiction. Unfortunately, they did have some responses from people, including reviewers, which made it clear that they hadn't read that far to the end and was commenting on it as if it was real legislation. So it is important to be clear about the plausibility and fictionality. Next slide, please. So this is the process we went through in going from our kind of initial discussions at Brockenhurst into where we wanted to get to with this project. So I'll mention in a minute that we started off with brainstorming and thinking about our scenarios, and then we actually did develop 4 of these design fiction objects, which I will go through in detail. And then I'll hand over to Peter, who will talk about how we then use these design fiction objects to actually assess them and think about the ethical questions using the moral IT cards. And that led to our outcomes, which we're actually still working on the moment to develop our ethical framework. Next slide, please. So Sammy mentioned the workshop we had at Brockenhurst, and we had this meeting and we said, yes, we want to think about these potential scenarios and speculations. And the diagram that's on the left-hand side is actually the one that we drew on the flipboard at that Brockenhurst meeting. And this was a brainstorm to really just think about, what might a data trust using AI in the food system be used for? What kind of features might it have? What might it do? So we mapped out this different process, and we decided to use for our example tracking of allergens across the food chain. So we started off thinking about, for example, nuts, where they would enter the food chain coming in imported as perhaps raw nuts, processed through different products, going into restaurants, going into supermarkets, and how the data that came in the trust from all these different processes could then go out again to give people information about the allergens. The next step after we had that meeting, when we wanted to come together and really develop these into design fictions, was to bring that together in a more formal way and say, what are the steps of the process? And this first stage was just really forming that world that I mentioned, our future, plausible future that we were then going to create our design fictions within. So you can see here we mapped out who all the different actors were, where data was coming into the system, where data might be coming out of the system and going to other people for different uses. And actually we started to think a little bit about the types of AI analysis and processing that might happen within this data trust, and also the different people who might have access to certain data. So some of these data points represented here, you can see have the little key on them. These are ones that would be held securely in the data trust and only transferred to certain people. Next slide, please. So the next stage of the process then is to really kind of define down from that broad picture what exactly it was we were thinking about in our fictional data trust that we could then develop our actual ideas out of. And this just here is an example of the really level of detail that we started to go into in that workshop. So this was a question we started asking, what data is collected in our fictional food trust? And we came up with lots of different types of ideas. So you might have metadata about the food and its journey. You might talk about the food origin, the times of its production, the dates of its production, the allergens, the certification, and things like sustainability. So the amount of water used, the environmental information about the fields, or the workers, or lots of different types of data. Next slide, please. And out of that, and out of our world building and our scenario which we put together, we came to agreement on 4 fictions which we were going to develop actually fully into these designed objects. And so to create these, we went through a full design process. So we mapped out all the different stakeholders who might be affected by this, what all the different aspects would look like. And from that, we created these fictional, I say objects, but they weren't all tangible objects, as you can see from this one, things that represented an aspect of that fictional world. So this is the first one, and this is some minutes from a board meeting held by the Food Data Foundation. So this is the organisation that governs and manages our data trust, and so the minutes themselves are our design fiction object because they are the minutes of a meeting that never actually took place. But we did map this out in a lot of detail. We gave, for example, who all the people at the meeting were, what their roles were. We had on our agenda things like consultation with an external ethics advisory board. We had discussion of some of the different ethical challenges raised by applications to this board. So the board were assessing proposals for different uses of the Food Data Trust data, and going through all the questions of ethics related to that. Next slide, please. So one of the proposals which are mentioned in this minutes is for an app alerting people to the presence of allergens in the system. And in the minutes, there was some questions about this, but our second design fiction was actually creating the details of that app. And we did that by creating a website which demonstrated the product, was advertising it. So it had a video on it which showed screen captures of somebody going through the process of using this. And what this app allows people to do, it's for members of the public. They can go into a supermarket, scan a product, and it will tell them, based on the data linked through the whole supply chain and using AI processing, be able to real-time tell someone what are the probabilities that that food product has been contaminated by allergens, and how safe is it going to be for that person to buy and consume. And this app is also working to particular personalization set by the person using it. So they have to input their data, and that might go back into the data trust as well. So we thought about all the movements of data and who would have access to this in a much greater detail actually than actually ended up in the website itself. Some of that information was hidden and not so clear. Next slide, please. And the website not only included details about the app, but it also represented all the different aspects surrounding this. So, for example, it included a privacy policy telling people who were signing up to use the app what would happen to their data. Now, in fact, it didn't necessarily answer all the questions some might have. So the idea of this was to start to provoke people into saying, well, wait a minute, what should be in a privacy policy? Does this meet those requirements? How is it protecting people or not protecting people? And raising questions about, for example, sensitive health data and how that might be used in wider connected data systems. Next slide, please. The third design fiction that we created was a short clip from a documentary film. So the idea was that this was, in our fictional world, there had been an incident where there had been some contamination incidents which actually led to food being withdrawn, some issues around suppliers being blacklisted. But in fact, this was due to an AI prediction system which took the information from the different providers and said there is a contamination incident here, but in fact, when it was looked at afterwards, it was found that this was not actually the case, and the prediction system had given a false positive. So the film that existed notionally was perhaps an hour and a half, but we created a 5-minute segment from this wider film, which represented some of these issues, and it included interviews with the different stakeholders represented in this process. So we had people from the governing board and the government offices overseeing this process, from the supermarkets who stock the products, and down the supply chain to the different producers, all talking about the impacts it had on them and their concerns and questions about using these automated processes. Next slide, please. So the final design fiction we created was the most speculative, the one that was perhaps least or furthest in the future in terms of using technologies that perhaps are in the early stages now. We wanted to make it still plausible, but we pushed it a little bit further and said, well, what about smart packaging as an outcome of the data being held in this data trust? So the design fiction object we created here was food packaging that actually had smart paper that changed in real time, giving information based on the data in the data trust. So here you can see the lasagna, which has a notice on it, and it's giving information about, in this case, the costings in the different production processes and who benefits from that. So we had also information about sustainability, about carbon footprints, and about the allergen data. And the outcome that we made of this included a little film of somebody taking this in and out of their freezer and seeing the different labeling on it, and actually having to discard the food when the product alert showed that it had been contaminated by allergens. Next slide, please. The smart packaging, as I said, was on these ready meals. We also thought about other types of products. So, for example, a self-service salad bar where you would print out the label based on what you put in your bowl, and also raw products like potatoes. And here you can see some of the different labels of information. So we really did plan out, as I said, the whole data flows, what data might be useful and might be presented to different people, to start to provoke some of these questions about, for example, well, who is affected if there is a need, for example, to track workers who are involved in the planting process at various stages. So by using all of these different design fictions, we were then able to, through the process of actually developing them, really start to unpick some of these questions in a very specific and concrete way. So we weren't just saying, for example, oh, what are the sustainability questions? We were saying, okay, if this product exists, who is affected in terms of sustainability, giving us a much clearer idea of the ethical questions. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass over here to Peter, I think, to talk about what we actually then ended up doing with our design fiction objects. So having created them, and as I say, finding out things through that creation and design process, we then developed a showcase where we could then assess them further. So I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. You've given a really good overview of the development process of the design fiction objects, the technologies that represent and are there to be assessed for their ethical implications. As she mentioned, we produced a showcase of these objects to show them to people cold sort of through videos and allowing people to read the minutes, for example. And then we set up a system to engage and assess the ethical implications they raise. And to do this, we used a tool I've developed with a colleague, the Moral IT deck, Moral IT cards, a tool for ethics by design. And I've almost forgotten that they exist in physical form. There's a few sets sat in front of me because all of this was necessarily done online. So as the images will show, but it's something we have done and will continue to do face-to-face roundtables in places like this in the future. So to take a step back for a second and just give a sort of overview of ethics by design, very rough ideas to help you sort of get up to pace with where we are. So for the purposes of how we sell this ethics, think of them as moral principles that influence judgments of right or wrong for a group or activity. And this leads on to ethics by design being ensuring that ethical considerations are designed into technology as opposed to agreed afterwards. I'm sure you've all seen the tick box of I agree to the terms and conditions when the ethics by design is intended to design things into the system so that you're not just having to agree to something you're never going to read. And so they become design requirements designed in from the start. And the elements of this is complementary to agendas such as responsible research and innovation. For example, the EPSRC's area framework, which encourages researchers to anticipate, reflect, engage and act in designing and doing their research on a continual basis. So as Naomi's sort of set out, a lot of the work is from design, and to do this we need a flexible and adaptable approach to enabling ethical considerations, ethics by design. And we used the design tools as an inspiration for this, ideation cards, which are cards, physical cards intended to structure and inspire creativity across domains, and adapted that to the Moral IT cards. And this is a project sort of started by Lachlan Urquhart along with me at the Horizon Digital Economy Institute at Nottingham. He's now a lecturer in technology law at Edinburgh. And the idea was to create a pragmatic tool as a probe to encourage reflection and engagement with ethics, especially for technology developers and researchers. Produced, as you'll see in front of me, I can explain and show in more detail if you're interested afterwards. A deck similar to playing cards. They have the playing cards markings on them so you can use them as such. And they're developed into 4 sort of rough suits or categories covering issues of privacy, law, security, ethics. And there's also a narrative one which helps set the context, although that wasn't used in the work we're talking about at the moment. And for more detail, there's a paper describing all of this in the Journal of Responsible Innovation, and you can see afterwards you get a PDF of the cards via the link there via Lachlan's website. So each card set out like this. To give you an example, they have a principle as a title. Underneath that is an image to illustrate, provoke and provide an alternative perspective, in this case fire extinguisher for the precautionary principle. Then underneath that, an open question to encourage engagement. It needs to be answered and cannot be dismissed. It's not to steer away from saying that's not relevant or a no, yes, no answer. Focused on your technology, which can be applied very broadly. It's starting from the point of technology involving personal data, but we haven't done it, but it could be a pencil, a horse and cart, and could maybe get some interesting insights like that. And linking to what we've done, Naomi's just given you the overview of a really developed process to define the technology for what we've been talking about in this particular example. And also, as an aside, compatible with a project we're working on called Cardographer, which is the idea of capturing these sessions, building up a repository of use and a database of that in order to get some insights into the use of the cards and the issues of ethics around in this particular example, as alongside other card sets. So just some examples of the cards here. For example, from the ethics deck, there's questions about well-being, fairness and justice, meaningful transparency. I think these issues link with some of the sort of talks we've had earlier in the week. Then there's spectrum of control rights or lawful processing from the privacy, particularly sort of issues from the GDPR, for example. Legal principles around issues of duty of care or accessibility. And then confidentiality and immutable security, for example, from the security suit. So these are just some examples. There's far more I can show you more detail if you're interested afterwards. Then we have a deck of cards. You need a game or a process to use them with. So this is the way we initially tested them, using what we term a sort of lightweight ethical risk assessment process using the cards. So this asks people to define a technology. We've got ours from the design fiction. Then we ask people to define an ethical issue or risk, which is associated with that. Then use the cards to identify and rank associated risks, identify safeguards against these risks, and then consider the challenge of implementing these safeguards. And through doing this process, as you can see in the photograph there, selecting the cards, annotating them, and going through that process, encouraging and enabling discussion between disparate groups and a wide variety of technologies. We've found that that's been borne out in doing this with a lot of different technologies across contexts. So moving on from that, that was just a risk assessment. So since then, we've added the positive element, because ethics is not just about avoiding harms, it's about maximising benefits as well. So in the same way you have identifying potential harms, now moving on to identifying the potential benefits. And this is a screenshot of the board from the most recent online version of Miro we have, but it's exactly the same way. If you have a benefit, how do you maximise that and the challenges of doing so? And doing this via Miro, for example, you would get something like this. You get technology at the top, then you'd have your potential benefits on the right-hand side, as many of those as you are asked to select, annotate them to explain and put them in context, find some ways of maximising them, and challenges of the ways to maximise the benefits, and similarly with the ways of identifying the harms and minimising the harms there. So that's just, this is the process we went through. I'm putting it there to illustrate it. This is a bit more advanced than what we did within the actual, the Food Data Trust project, because we did this for accessibility's sake via a PDF and a note sheet in order to do the same process and make it as accessible as possible to people. So this just sets out the requirements and what we ask people to do with the actual session of the workshop and following the showcase. So the science fiction objects were the technology for the focus of discussion. They were considered individually to start with and then combined together to consider the overall system. All of this was done online via Zoom, and the cards were distributed via PDF and with a note sheet filled in. We had an initial open discussion, which was to explore the design fictions prior to using the cards, about asking what questions they raise, what they tell you about the data trust concept, what potential benefits and harms, and then moved on to the substantive moral IT card session of stage one, which is what I'll focus on most for the rest of this talk, is taking each individual design fiction, sorting through the cards and finding one you consider to be an ethical benefit or a positive of the system, one for an ethical harm, and then they explain why. And then stage two is combining those together for the overall system, positives and negatives. Then stage three, ways of maximising the positives, minimising the negatives. And then stage four, the challenges of doing those. And I'll give you some brief reflections on that as we go towards the end. So I know I said this was done with a PDF and note sheet. This is a visualization representation of one of the group's work in relation to the cards they selected. So starting in the top left-hand corner, we have the packaging, for example, and some people thought that a positive of that on the left-hand side is user empowerment and negotiability. It enabled the users to have a greater power over the data and their choice of products and through the information that was provided with that. But some people identified the sustainability issue of what are going to be the implications of having all this technology, all these bits of food packaging connected to the internet, and how much power is that going to take, and is that justifiable? Looking at the minutes, for example, in the top right-hand corner, that people thought that as a positive of that was about sort of consumer protection, because it showed that the board was there in terms of to represent the interests of the consumers, but also maybe a question around the bias of the people who are represented on the board and whether that represented any power asymmetry which exists within the food system. The documentary in the bottom right-hand corner, for example, again talked about people being able to participate in issues of meaningful transparency, so to show how the system works, but it highlighted and identified particular failures of fairness and justice, because the small player in the food system was actually affected most significantly by the false alert via the system. Then the bottom left was the alert app, which showed people could participate, it would be accessible to them and increase their well-being, so by enabling them to monitor their allergens and exposure to that. But there's a question about how trustworthy it might be, what might happen to people's sensitive categories of data, for example. So that's just a brief overview of one group's work within that. And this is an amalgamated overview of each of the cards that people picked from the first section of the stage one of this. So at the top, there's the cards that were majority picked as positives or benefits of the system. At the bottom, negatives or harms, and the ones in the middle are more issues of contention, ones which were potentially harms and potentially benefits at the same time. So it gives you a reasonable overview of the overall view of the system. So the positives of the system, following due process and considering physical safety and contributing to people's well-being, for example, through consumer protection and a duty of care. But on the negative side, questions of how resilient and how might it work, or how might it deal with the special categories of health data, for example. How fair or biased might it be, and who will be liable or responsible for it, or how trustworthy it might be. And then the mixed bits in the middle, ones that could go either way, need to be specially considered, issues of trust or transparency, meaningful transparency, how legible it may be, what the power asymmetry issues might come from that, how to empower users, how accessible, and how they may participate within that system. So that gives you a very whistle-stop tour of the sort of cards used, lots of rich discussion around this as well, but gives you sort of the issues raised through the system. So this is the stages 3 and 4, some issues that came out of this. So ways of maximising the benefits and positives of this system. People talked about enabling people to participate in the design of the system, and also maybe technical elements by ensuring privacy by design to ensure that sensitive data is protected within that. Minimising potential harms. People talked about reducing the scope for financial advantage and issues of how to engender trust within the system. And then some of the challenges that were raised within this, financial elements, who owns the data and how might that be accommodated within the system. And this is a distributed system, potentially globally distributed system with many actors. How do you ensure everyone's working the same way? How to ensure trust, and people potentially could over-trust it, blind trust related to this. So how do you accommodate that? And how do you accommodate unforeseen misuse if somebody sort of hacks the label of your food product, for example, is an issue that was raised. And people talked about international and cultural elements. The food system is very distributed globally from producers to consumers. So how do you take account of the cultural context and what they might think and believe of the information given to them, for example? And it was also highlighted that this, although we did it in one workshop, could and probably should be part of a process of, okay, we've raised these issues, what do we do next, and how do we actually go about designing this into a potential system were we to take this further. So that just gives you a very quick sort of view of the richness of some of the discussions that were prompted by the design fictions in combination with the cards. So very much a whistle-stop tour. The cards have also been used in a couple of other activities associated with the network. Did a workshop from the on the AI for Good at the Web Science 20 conference, which looked at the NHS COVID tracing app, looked at participated in the Failed It to Nailed It event as part of the Physical Sciences data service system, looking at responsible data management. I had some really interesting discussions around data management plans facilitated by the cards, and also as part of the Skills for Scientists AI4SD and PSDS workshops where they assessed and used these cards in combination with a smart lab scenario, for example, one where all the equipment is connected to the internet. So after that whistle-stop tour, then hand over to Sammy to just wrap things up.
Thanks very much, Peter. So yeah, I mean, that Peter's end slide has already shown, we have used some of these processes quite a lot already in different situations, and they've been really good for training as well, because we think that everybody needs ethics. It's not just the ethicists, we need scientists, computer scientists, all of us need that, and we need to consider that in our work. And overall, that the methodologies we've used, we think will be really useful moving forward. And if anyone's interested in getting involved in our ethics working group, obviously come and find us, we'll be here. So just wanted to wrap up with a few of our publication information. So we have published a paper in The Wonderful Patterns, run by Sarah. We have had our glossary paper accepted pending revision, so that's the second one, submitted to Trends in Food Science and Technology. We've also submitted and are awaiting a decision on a paper for the Journal of Responsible Technology. And we currently have our design fiction paper and our ethical frameworks paper in progress. I feel like we've actually, at the risk of self-congratulation, but mostly congratulations to my lovely group members, we've achieved quite a lot in the 2 years. We rocked into this workshop in Brockenhurst, no idea what was going to happen or whether this was going to go anywhere. And we have had pretty much, I think at one point we were having fortnightly meetings. It's weird, I've only actually ever met, this is the third time I've ever been in a room with Peter. And I've only met, apart from Sam, obviously, the rest of the working group once. And yet we've come together. In a way, the pandemic was possibly a bit helpful to the group, because actually our original plan was to go meet in Nottingham, because geographically we're all quite distributed. And then we realised that actually, yeah, it's lovely to come together and do these things, and it would be fantastic to organise some physical workshops and to actually play with Peter's cards properly, rather than having them over a screen. But in terms of our fortnightly meetings, given how far away we are, it was actually really useful to know that we could run that sort of thing over Zoom. So these are our publications, and then just finish up with our future plans. So obviously we need to finish our journal papers. We would like to organise some in-person workshops, and most importantly, we want to apply for new funding to continue our research and to extend it into different areas and different domains. So just want to finish up with a big thank you to all of our different members of our working groups, and these are just the logos of both our networks, but also all the universities of our working group participants. So thank you very much.
Thank you.